welcome to section 2.5 of the book, Transgender Ideology and Gender Dysphoria. The topic for this lecture is gender variation. I'm Jake Thibault. This is going along with my book, so this is a bit of a study aid. You can either use it to go along with the book, or if you just want to watch the videos, that's fine too. We're in, again, chapter 2, right at the beginning, kind of laying out the approach. So under gender variation, there's this argument that our binary gender sex system is a Western concept which has colonized the rest of the world. Therefore, the rest of the world had a way that was different and maybe more varied than the Western approach. And the Western approach has kind of forced us into this Judeo-Christian approach to sex and gender. And therefore, if we just uncolonized, if we decolonized, then we would go back to a more natural perspective. And part of this argument also looks at the different variations within sex and gender around the world and in pre-colonized cultures, pre-colonized groups, and uses this as a argument that if we just let things go back to a natural state, you would see more variation. The reason why we don't see this variation is because of the Western Judeo-Christian colonized approach. So this is the argument. So I'm going to address this within this section, although it's not as if I will come to a declarative statement. I'm just going to be laying out the arguments, and you can look further into each of the sections, or maybe some of my insights might be helpful in trying to make sense of it. So when we look at the uncolonized approach, there's two, I would call them myths. They're kind of ideologies. Now you can look at the facts and see if you agree with them or disagree with them, but I think it's fair to call them myths. One is this kind of myth of the uncolonized utopia, that before the colonizers came, there was kind of a utopian way of existing, kind of a Jean-Jacques Rousseau, noble savage approach. It's really society that's destroyed us. In nature, we were more perfect, this approach. Just before the Europeans got there, it was a more perfect society. Therefore, we should imitate pre-colonial societies, or try to go back to pre-colonial societies. That's one claim. The other one is the myth that uncolonized people were vastly different than colonial people. So this idea that, well, America used to be one way, right? This kind of utopia. And then the colonial people came who had a completely different way of approaching things, and they destroyed the natural people who were here. It's looking at people as very different groups of people, right? That it kind of looks at them as different. I heard when I was at Standing Rock, people claim, before the colonial powers came, there was no war within the United States. This was a foreign concept. There was no fear. There was no anger. There was no, nobody killed one another in the United States before the colonial powers came. When I hear this, I kind of raise an eyebrow, thinking, I don't think that's true, right? And it's not because I believe that the native peoples were worse than the colonizers. I don't. But uncolonized people and colonized people share one thing in common: they're human beings, and with that, they have perhaps more in common, both the good and the bad, than we'd like to admit. Again, part of the myth of the uncolonized utopia, this idea that there was just, this idea that Native American people were kind of these environmentalists, they were communists, they were living in this type of non-commercial utopia. It's not really based on fact, and plenty of Native American scholars would agree with this stance, that this is just not an accurate stance. In 2018, in Peru, we found a mass grave of 140 children who had been ritually sacrificed before the colonialists got there. Bad things happened when the colonialists got there. Bad things happened before the colonialists got there, and bad things happen now, right? And also, there's a bit of these types of narratives, like Timothy Taylor, in a book on prehistory of sex, claimed that colonizers systematically destroyed sculptures, jewelries, and monuments that depicted and celebrated such practices, meaning sexual diversity and multiple genders and things like that. Well, it leads you to ask the question, if the colonizers did such a good job systematically destroying all of these things so that there is no record of them, how would Dr. Taylor know that they exist, right? This is just a logical question to which he doesn't answer, right? They had all of this and then it got destroyed and now, it's been covered up. Well, if it's covered up, then how do you know about it? It's a fair enough question to ask. Could go into a list of bad things from pre-colonial times, but that's really not the point. It's just the point to say, really, it's just this idea that, well, everything was great before the colonizers came and they had multiple genders before colonizers came, therefore we should just go back to that. Well, even if there were 3 genders in some non-colonized societies, there's certainly enough things within pre-colonized societies that would make us think we don't want to replicate everything that they did, right? We're saying, oh, if they did it in the pre-colonial period, then it must be right. Well, not really, right? There was a number of bad things that happened in pre-colonial societies that we don't imitate today, right? It's not the cure for our current modern issue, right? It still has to be looked at critically. Another myth of the uncolonized is, again, that we are vastly different. Colonized versus uncolonized are vastly different from one another. Dr. Schmidt, David Schmidt, did a report of 55 countries revealing that women across the spectrum tended to be more agreeable, conscientious, nurturing, and cautious, and neurotic, while men tended to be more competitive and risk-taking, across different societies, many different societies. This idea that we are vastly different is somewhat overstated. In general, women within every culture are more similar to women, and men are more similar to men. There are differences, but it's not good to overstate the differences. Now we're just breaking down some of these because they get thrown out kind of almost as fact, right? There's the Two-Spirit people, and there's the Hijas, and there's the Ladyboys, and so therefore this has always existed, and it's always good, and it's just this Western perspective that is demonizing it. Well, let's look. I'm just bringing it up here. We're bringing it up. So the Two-Spirit people. So this idea came out of the Great Plains natives. So, we tend to think of the Native Americans as a unified group, which they clearly are not a unified group, right? You're talking about hundreds of tribes. You're not talking about a unified people any more than you can talk about Africans in a generalized sense, right? These are different nations, right? So, but there is overlap, right? There's overlap between some of these cultures. So among the Great Plains, there was the group called the Berdache, which was most literally translated to young prostitutes. You see this theme throughout these pre-colonized groups where the sexual variations often become prostitutes within a culture. In the 1990s, there was a kind of a reaction against this term, the Berdache. Nowadays somebody might say, oh, Berdache, thinking that they are so clever using this foreign word, but it really means young prostitute. It's kind of an offensive term. So they came up with Two-Spirit, or Wergerin is another term, to kind of get rid of the prostitution perspective. In Latin America, there was the Maki, and they had a very ritualized purpose as well. So you see this theme that these groups within a society are often used in prostitution, but also had a ritual and somewhat sacred perspective. You do see this as a common theme, even globally, with this type of group of people. Father Jacques Marquette, Jesuit, he kept track of what he saw when he was the first, some of the first European travelers through the Midwest, and he pointed out that they had some young boys assumed female dress and kept it their whole lives. The mystery about it, for they never marry and glory in debasing themselves to do what women do. So they're boys, so they don't do women's work. Yet they go to war, but they're not allowed to use a bow and arrow like men, only a club. And they're permitted to sing like women, but not to dance. And they attend councils, and nothing can be decided without their advice. And some of them are considered as manitous, which were people of great consequence. So, they're kind of have male roles, kind of have female roles. They're kind of outcasts, but they're also very important when it comes to making some type of important decision for the tribe. This kind of combination of the spiritual and the sexual is kind of put together there. Another Jesuit priest, Pierre-Francois Xavier de Charlevoix, he pointed out that it seemed like people within this group, they were often had very important rituals, spiritual roles within a society, but it is also somewhat undetermined who they are. Are these people who are from a young age forced into this type of position? Are they young boys who have been selected, maybe the orphan children have been selected to be in this role? Were they perhaps more homosexual, or are they more gender dysphoric or transgender? Right? These were distinctions that the Jesuits were not making in the 18th century, right? Weren't making these in the 19th century. They weren't making these distinctions, but they exist. But they kind of are male, kind of female, and a lot is unknown. The Mahu, which are from Hawaii and Polynesian cultures, the Polynesians are very interesting because they have names that are both meant for men and women. They're not gendered names. There's more gender neutrality within the Polynesian culture, but they have a myth that sometimes Mother Nature cannot make up her mind whether to make a man or a woman, even in Polynesia, so she mixes up a little bit of male and a little bit of female. But again, it's not entirely clear if you're talking about this intersex, for one, homosexual, another, or transgender, a third, right? This is kind of applies to all of the above, right? Anyone with an atypical sexuality kind of gets lumped together into this type of category. So again, it's not entirely clear. Somebody could say, well, look at the Mahu, right? That's an example of a transgender group of people who existed in pre-colonial times. Is it transgender? We really don't know, right? It could be homosexual, it could be transgender, it could be intersex, right? It's not really as clearly distinguished as we think it is, right? In cultures that are based on non-written cultures, can then just come up with whatever they want. This is a bit of a blessing or a curse from pre-colonial people of the book type of perspective. They can say whatever they want. Well, we used to be like this. This was our tradition. Well, when it's not written, there's no way to verify it, right? When it's word of mouth, things can change a lot from one generation to the next, and especially over hundreds of years. It's difficult to say, well, we always believed this. Well, without books, it's hard to know what you always believe, right? If the Western Christian world were to get away with, well, we always believed this, it would be a very different culture. Now we say, well, we always believed this. You could find a book from the 1500s that says differently, right? If we could get away with, well, we always said this, we wouldn't, we could get over the Crusades, right? The Crusades never happened because, well, that never happened because it would be an inconvenient truth if it happened. So it's easier to say it doesn't happen. But we can't say that because there were books, right? So some of these pre-colonial cultures, they can say whatever they want because there's no books, right? So it's a little bit, we just don't know, right? We don't know. The Mahu as well, they have a particular role within society, and that was to take care of children because they had a creative and compassionate side, and and presumably they're not having their own biological children. So if you're not having your own children, you could be caretakers of children. So again, not quite clear if you're talking homosexual or you're talking intersex or transgender. Now we have from Thailand, we have the Kathoey and the Toms. The Kathoey are sometimes called ladyboys, but like the other terms like the Berdash, it often has a sex worker type of mentality about it. There's a ladyboy kind of referred to as a prostitute. So some people don't like that, so they prefer Kathoey, and that's males who appear more female, and females who appear more male are Toms. So they present as men. Still a little bit unclear, particularly with Toms, if they are really would they under our understanding be understood as gender dysphoric. They seem to be more perhaps presented as lesbians, right? More of a masculine female who likes feminine women, right? A butch woman who likes more lesbian female women. Transgender, who knows, right? We don't really know. Ladyboys, these would be, and we'll get into this term later on, androphilic transgender people, or it could even be extreme forms of kind of a homosexuality. The young boys that are so gay that they're women, right? This is kind of the perspective. It's just, if you're a very feminine male and you like men, it's easier in some ways to present as a female, right? Especially if the culture allows for that or promotes that. That could be the case. We don't really know, right? The other term that might be more appropriate now is the waria, which it deals with combines the terms male and man and woman together, so kind of a man woman together, and they're often within their cultures kind of transvestite performers and involved in prostitution as well. This goes all the way back. You could say, well, this is kind of this is what colonialism does to trans people. It turns them into prostitutes. That could be a fair enough claim. But even the Kama Sutra goes all the way, is pre-colonial. It goes all the way back to talking about these kind of ladyboys and Toms, and has included them within the courtesans of the temple, of the political sphere, and they were often used as sexual objects. So this goes back to pre-colonial times. You'll see these types of sexual abnormal people, right? Somebody with an atypical sexuality being turned into a sexual object, even in pre-colonial times. Okay, in England you have the people might know the Irhas, but again that's another term that kind of means prostitute. So they prefer to be called the kinner now, so I refer to them as kinner because that's what they want to be referred to. They only about 8% of the Kinner of India receive castration. They would be male to female presenting, but very few of them go through any type of medical procedure. Because of that, they often have very male features. They're not very... the ladyboys can be very convincingly female because of I guess Thai people have more or less facial hair and more androgynous characteristics to begin with. The Kinner, however, often look very male, even though they present as female. Very few surgeries or changes. They are officially recognized as a third sex within India, being neither male nor female. So kind of an interesting one, because as a third sex, you're not saying I'm a male who is a female or a female who is a male. You're saying I'm neither, right? A third sex is neither male nor female. So a Kinner is not a woman, it's a third gender under India. They are often seen as very unusual characters, again, kind of following the theme of being sexualized, a lot of prostitution. Most of them make their income from prostitution. But then they also do strange things, like they show up to weddings and they act obnoxiously until you pay them to go away, but it's also seen as a sign of good luck, right? It's kind of a marital blessing to have one of these Kinner show up, but at the same time, their role is to be obnoxious and be thrown out. Again, is this transgender? I don't, is it gender dysphoric? Is it homosexual? Is it cultural? Right? It's a little bit difficult to identify, right? So I think, again, you can't just say, well, the Kinner are an example, therefore it's proven. Nothing's really proven, right? It raises more questions than answers. Iran is another interesting case. The number one country in the world for transgender surgeries is Thailand. The number two is Iran, which you would think that doesn't seem to make sense. Thailand makes sense, right? Polynesian culture, maybe. Yeah, Iran, it's pretty conservative. Well, why would they have so many? Well, in 1979, the fatwa instituted by the Iranian Revolution a policy whereby they considered non-heterosexual, cis heterosexual people intersex. So anybody, unless you're a heterosexual person, you are they're figuring you have an intersex brain. Therefore, if you are a homosexual, you are actually intersex. So the rule is, if you are a homosexual, you can either have the surgery and become the opposite sex, or if you get caught with homosexual activity, you'll be killed. So you can either, if you're homosexual, you can either act as a heterosexual or be a homosexual but risk being put to death, or change your sex. Those are your three options. And for some people, if a man falls in love with another man, it might be easier to just have, the more feminine of the relationship, if there is one, the more feminine one has a sex change and becomes a woman, and now they're perfectly fine within society. The alternative is to risk being put to death, or just get married to a woman, right? Those would be your options. And there's even grants for getting the surgery done. It's kind of, some people might say, well, that's great that they're paying for these surgeries, but, the head religious leader in charge of these surgeries, what he said is, the discussion is fundamentally separate from the discussion regarding homosexuals. It's absolutely not related. Homosexuals are doing something unnatural and against religion, therefore they're put to death. Our Islamic law clearly states that such behavior is not allowed because it disrupts the social order. So in order to preserve the social order, they will turn homosexuals into transsexuals as the solution. So I think that is a bit... Some of these people having the surgery, it's not that they want the surgery, it's just the least bad option available to them in Iran. So now, approaching the end, this one's a bit of a stretch, but it might be raised, is the Italian castrati, right? People castrated. This occurred, this was condemned by the church in the First Council of Nicaea, but it continues throughout even Italy until the 1870s when it's outlawed secularly. Part of the reason why they existed was because women were not allowed on stage to perform. If you recall from Shakespeare, the men all played the women parts. So if you had a female person within the opera, the theater, or the church choir, the voices, it would be nice to have somebody who was castrated because they had a female voice, they had more female appearances, they could sing the high notes. You think of all these great operas. How do you perform all those great operas with no women? Well, you have castrati. These people are often not people who chose to be castrati, right? Because it would only work if you were castrated at a very young age, right? Pre-puberty. So how many pre-puberty kids want to be castrated? Well, orphans, right? They don't have much of an option. But for some of them, if you were a parent and you very poor family, it might not be a bad option if you have a lot of kids that you can't afford, because if you became a castrati, you could have an important role within, the stage, the theater, the choirs. It was a job, right? It was a good gig within society. Without it, you might starve to death. So it wouldn't be something we would see as really voluntary. At best, parents voluntarily made their kids get castrated. At its height, there were probably about 4,000 castrati in Italy in the 18th century, and the last of the castrati, who was the director of the Sistine Chapel Choir, died in 1922, and you can listen to him on YouTube if you look him up. You can hear his voice. Are they transgender? Not really, right? Not really voluntarily, but how many were some of the other people from the Kinner or the Berdache, were they all voluntary? Well, we don't know that either, right? Maybe, maybe it was voluntary, maybe it was forced, just like the castrati were forced of Italy. Now, the last group, the tribal group, is the America currently, right? So I'm going to look at this one because I think this is very interesting. When you look at the Williams Institute report from 2016, of people who identify as transgender, it's 0.58% of Americans identify as transgender. So that's the rate of 5.8%. So if we want to look at the United States as a tribe, right, our tribe, any state with higher than 5.8% would be above average, right? A higher number of transgender people than other states. So 5.8, any state with over 5.8. So here there's a list on my left. I imagine it appears on your left. When we look at those states, I broke them also down by the states by conservative versus liberal states, and even then the top 10 conservative versus the top 10 liberal states. So when we look at this list on the left, anything that's in the gray is considered a conservative state. If it's bold, it's in the top 10 either conservative or liberal states. So if we look at these numbers, now this might be a bit confusing, but I'll try to make sense of it. On this list, how many of these states are conservative states, of the states that are above average for the amount of transgender people who identify as transgender? You have Georgia, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Arizona, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana. So you have 10. 10 of the states are conservative. Of the liberal states, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So nine of the states above average are liberal, and 10 of the states above average are conservative, right? So more conservative states have more transgender people than liberal states, just to start off with. Well, how about of the top 10 most conservative states, do they have transgender people? Well, when we look at this, Oklahoma is in the top 10 most conservative states, and they have above average transgender people. Tennessee, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana. So of the 10 most conservative states in the United States, half of those most conservative states have above average levels of transgender people. Well, that's right. You wouldn't think the top 10 most conservative states, half of them would have above average levels of transgender people. Well, how about liberal, right? So you have Hawaii, California, Oregon, Washington, and Vermont. So of the 10 most liberal states in the United States, 5 of the 10 most liberal states in the United States have above average levels of transgender people. So 5 of the most conservative and 5 of the most liberal have the most amount of transgender people. That says to me that the transgender issue is not a Berkeley, California, or Cambridge, Massachusetts issue, right? When Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, and Oklahoma have higher levels of people who identify as transgender than Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New York, right? Very liberal areas, right? I think you would then conclude that it doesn't have anything to do with being in a conservative versus liberal state, right? Now you could break down by county, right? I know there's conservative versus liberal counties. I don't have that data. I'm not sure that data exists, but I think it's clear from this that saying, first step globally, does gender dysphoria or some type of general gender abnormalities exist globally? Yes. How about in the United States? Well, pre-colonial, yes. How about post-colonial? Still yes. Within the tribalism of liberalism and conservatism, it exists equally within liberal and conservative areas. So therefore, to say that there must be something intrinsic within there must be something there that's other than just cultural, right? It can't be just cultural, right? Or just a liberal versus conservative issue. At the same time, right? Does it mean that there is a third gender? No. And the historical examples, does it mean that these people are transgender? Again, we don't know. We don't know if people are intersex, transgender, homosexual, or something else, right? Or they're just into, maybe there's another reason, right? We don't really know the answer. And from pre-colonial times, the best, the indigenous people often left no written record. The written records is from the colonial people, and it might be biased, it might be accurate, but we only have the one-sided account. Therefore, it's difficult to make any absolute conclusions based on this type of data. Although I think if we look at the American example that's up right now, it's clear to see that this isn't just a pre-colonial thing, right? And it's appearing everywhere, right? When there's above average levels of transgender people in Arkansas and Alabama, I think it's in Mississippi, right? I think it's fair enough to say it's an issue, right? It's an issue. Okay, that's all we will cover here. The next lecture will be on human nature. Or what is a human person? What is the nature of human nature? We'll get into that, a bit more philosophical again. Okay, have a good day.